Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cyber Week 2020, the final day of Cyber Week 2020. The clock is ticking down. The optimist in me wants to say the clock is already ticking towards Cyber Week 2021. My name is Noam Ebner. I'm here for my talk today. I'm also on Cyber Week's organizing committee, so I'll just go ahead and introduce myself and my colleagues who might wander in later or may not. Leah Wing and Colin Rule, who have been on the organizing committee with me, and of course have done most of the work. And it's just been thrilling to meet so many new people, to see so many familiar faces. It has been joyous for me, and I know not just for me. Welcome aboard, everybody. Today, we're going to discuss something that we couldn't have predicted a year ago, which is not the first time this has happened in conversations on ODR. The who and what of this session is, first of all, I want to recognize and welcome and again be joyous that there is a whole crowd of recently online transitioned mediators who a year ago did not attend Cyber Week ODR, and this year you are attending, and that is cause for joy. And this is not the first time that an entire new crowd has suddenly kind of jumped into the ODR group. At the last International Forum on ODR, which we held in Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, there were dozens, maybe over 100 representatives from court systems who hadn't been there last year because ODR in the courts wasn't as much of a thing. It wasn't suddenly snowballing into a thing. So that was last year's added group, and here is this year's added group. And the issues I'd like to speak about today that are pertinent to this group is looking back, looking at now, and looking ahead. Like why haven't we been doing this all our lives? And what were our resistances, and what happened when we actually transitioned online? Were they borne out or not? Have we figured out yet what makes for good online practice? What happens? How is it different? Not in terms of what people told us, but in terms of what we're actually meeting. And finally, what does this mean about our future? Both now for whatever period that online mediation, coerced online mediation, so to speak, goes on, and beyond, which is my general term for the vague after COVID. It's a session that has, I think, will have interest to the seasoned, familiar regulars, ODR in the group, some of whom who've been around far longer than the about 15 years that I've been working in ODR, both in practice and also teaching and researching at Creighton University in Omaha, in the US. And this is as much as a surprise to us in that sense than it is to anyone else. We had been used to advocating to some extent for ODR to spread. We had engaged, I think many of us have engaged in 1,000 different conversations with mediation and other ADR practitioners about why online, or listening to them about why not online. And all of a sudden, this shift has happened, and I've felt it vitalize so much in our field, which is part of the reason that I'm using the word joy a lot. And I also think that we have a lot to learn from it about mapping out the new ODR field. And I also think that it can challenge us, all of us, to new ODR development, particularly looking ahead to the beyond, when we have this wider group of participants, this wider group of people who are at least willing to listen, not only those who are here in the room or attending Cyber Week, but far beyond that. How can we use this as an evolutionary growth opportunity? And finally, I'm going to use this talk as an opportunity. Nobody can summarize Cyber Week. So there's nobody in the agenda who has to summarize Cyber Week. I will pull some threads together just because as I woke up this morning and started to think about, okay, so I know what I'm going to talk about, it seemed to me that, but Graham had talked about this little bit, and in a conversation, Bill mentioned that little bit, and then Sir Richard had discussed this, and it all fits in. And I want to do a bit of, whether it's summarizing or synthesis, or at least just helping us realize how, despite how diverse the many areas and the many practices of ODR are, that it is quite possible to tie everything into one talk. I'm not going to try and do everything, but we'll see that as we go along. So let's look back a little, okay? And this is a slide that my friend and colleague Nikki Borowski from New York City created to try and kind of picturalize, conceptualize the 5 stages of virtual ADR, kind of parallel to the 5 stages of grief. And at first, denial and I don't want to do this, or this will never work. Gradually, we became familiar with it. We started doing it, and we realized it wasn't so terrible. What role will this take in our practice, or what part will this play in our practice in the future? That's an open question. But I think, and this is something that Chimdima raised already back on the first day of Cyber Week in the student scholarship panel, that the whole transition online was very rapid. And of course, it comes after 25 years of, as if we're looking at stage 1 denial, so that was the first 25 years of the relationship of most ADR practitioners to ODR. This can't work, it's never going to work, you can't do it, you need to be face-to-face, and we'll get a little into that later. What happened then, of course, and we were all there, and this is, Chindy also pointed out the nature of this, but I'll also, just to put this into proportion. So the next was, depending on where you were in the world, this might have been, pick your least favorite 2 weeks of life, right? And it was somewhere between February 15th or maybe, or even perhaps January in Asia. And in the United States, it was somewhere between March 5th and April 5th. So in my mind, this is all placed around the Ides of March, where in 2 weeks, stages 2, 3, and 4 at least took place, and sometime over the next 2 weeks. For most practitioners, stage 5 as well. This is what stage 4 and 5. This is what happened was, people didn't want to do this, and there were lots of cautionary tales, not necessarily pertinent, but they were cautionary, like Zoom bombing, which to the best of my knowledge, I do not know a single mediation session that was Zoom bombed, but it was the type of kind of, oh no, what do we do if? Trainers popped up, some familiar, some less, showed people mainly how to push the bells and, how to push the buttons and do the levers in Zoom. And people finally had their first session, and it worked. And that is basically, that's the bottom line, it worked. A little more on that later. And then stage 5 now is where we've been, many people around the world have been for the past 6 months. So that's where we are today. And the question of preference, I'm going to leave that open. A good friend of mine, hi Leah, I'm glad you joined. I've already thanked you for being on the organizing committee, and now's my chance to say that, together with saying a good friend of mine, Colin Rule, has said that the problem with trying to make predictions about technology is that you generally look really silly after a couple of years. And he should know, and I should know, because I fall into that trap more than once. So I'm not going to talk about the preference element of this. I'm sure some will, and some have already vowed, once this is over, I am never touching Zoom again. And we'll consider some of the after later on, okay? But this is what's brought us up to this point. Now, diving into particularly the first part, the resistance stage, the denial stage, and this is something that, again, Chimdima had mentioned in the student scholarship panel, and Graham Ross mentioned it in his session on AI and Smart Saddle, is that a lot of what people sensed was missing was that human touch, whatever the human touch is, and we'll discuss that soon. But the notion, I think that those who have been in this biz for a while and have had hundreds of those conversations as to why or why not, I can't think of a term that has come up more often than the human touch. Whatever it is mediation is dependent on, that mediation magic, that good old stuff we stir into the pot, whatever it is, however you formulate it, that doesn't come over online, was the assumption. And for that reason, many people explained to me, and at length, that you could never mediate online. Now, of course, this is in my, I had already been mediating online for years, but that, and just so were many others. But it was always often framed as you can't. I always found that interesting. It was very rarely framed as I prefer not. And I think that's something we're going to see post in the beyond. At last, we're going to hear real conversations as to preference, and hopefully, the follow-up questions will be, why do you prefer that? And then we'll get into talking about the nuances, and that's the new conversations that we are going to have. But back then, it was more of the you can, you can't. And I always felt that underneath the you can't were always other stories. I called them resistories. I think that we each have a personal history in evolving with technology. And I think that we all have a resistory. Sometimes it's the way we resisted technology. For some of us, there's like this one technology that we will not use. And I'm sure you all know what it is for you. So it's like some people saying, I will never read a book on a Kindle. Douglas Adams has put it in terms of age. And I think first of all, I think it doesn't really cut down according to age. And I don't think that Douglas Adams thinks that it cuts down strictly in terms of age. But I think we can all recognize what he says. It is quite natural for people to resist change. People specifically experience resistance towards technological change. And some of that is age, and I like to say if it's not age, so some of us have, have an older spirit than others. But the point of resistance and how that's a human, that's natural, I think that underlies a lot of the resistance that used to be to online mediation. I know that in in-depth conversations, when I could ask people, they'd say it would never work. And then I'd say, oh, tell me more about that, and try to kind of channel the conversation less to absolutes and more to what do you think, what do you feel, then that would come out that there's an issue of personal comfort and personal efficacy. What if it goes wrong? What if I don't know what to do? What if my clients know more about technology than I do? So no one's done studies on this in mediation. I know that in online teaching, which is another field I deal in, studies on teacher resistance to online teaching were conducted, again, back in the days when we had that luxury called choice. And in teaching, although of course there were just as many people who would say, no, you have to bring the human touch to the classroom, that strong personal bonding connection that you form with your students. You can't replicate that online. The cover was exactly the same. And yet in research that was done in teaching, it was found that very often it was issues of personal efficacy and concerns about how I will cope with it. And I think that that's fair enough, right? None of us, very few of us were born into this world. As it is, certainly none of us were born into, but depending on whether we're digital natives or digital immigrants, nobody was born into 2020. But come March, choice became a luxury. Let's leave that aside for a moment and let's turn to the more seasoned or established ODR field, which had mixed responses. And one response was mobilization. It was joy. It was yay, right? This is, we've been here. We know what can be done. We know this stuff and we can help others learn it. And there was a lot of that. And that was delightful to see, delightful to be a part of, delightful to form partnerships, and how can we work together to help kind of this influx of immigration into this new world, even refugees perhaps into this new world. And there was a bit, and I think that I think that anybody who has been in the ODR field for a while must have felt, I'll say that I, at certain points, so yeah, well, I'm glad finally, right? It's receiving recognition, right? You can do this. We know you can do it. It's not only that we're right now, we were right 5 years ago, and Ethan was right 25 years ago. Even if we allowed ourselves to feel that, we wouldn't allow ourselves to say it. And if we did allow ourselves to say it, we would always say things like, of course, this is not the way we wanted this to come about, but. But there was also another set of reactions that involves some resistance on the ODR field, some pushback. You heard this in conversations, either just talking about what was going on, or on conversations seeking to define ODR, or perhaps redefine ODR a little more carefully, that occurred over the past 6 months. I noticed changes in tones, but I also noticed people coming out and saying the problem is that, people are coming online and with their online mediation, but that's not real ODR. It's what it is. And ODR is so much more. And the lovely thing is that both of these things existed at once. And those many people both had this sense of, wait, this isn't really a match, or it's not really the same thing, but they were still happy that more people were in the crowd and helping people. So let's say the ODR field had mixed responses and mixed emotions, or mixed emojis perhaps. And that's fair enough. But I'd like to dig down into just as we dug down into the online mediator resistance, I think it's fair to dig down into the ODR field resistance to this, or concerns about this. And I think that if there was any theme that came out in many conversations that I held, it's the concern that the kind of general discussion on online remote transitioned mediation, Zoom mediation, let's call it, was flattened together with ODR, then that would sort of take over the conversation. And lots of people would think, oh, I know what ODR is, it's Zoom mediation. And at some point that would lead to negative outcomes. And one thing is just terrible conceptual and terminological mishmashes. Okay, people would talk about ODR and online mediation in the same, like in the same terms. Like, so they would say like, oh yes, I'm conducting ODR. What they really mean is they're conducting, let's say, a Zoom mediation. Or someone would say, yes, I know all about the Zoom mediations that's been done. And it never worked. It's really a terrible thing to do. And they would use that as a reason, let's say, to kind of speak out against, let's say, a court-based ODR program that has nothing to do with Zoom-based mediation. Okay, just as examples. And the same thing happened in the ADR field. I've been saying for a while, we need to learn the lessons. There were some painful lessons in ADR field. And if you go to ADR conferences with professionals and even academics, and you hear how often the terminology is used one used to express the other, people saying ADR when they quite clearly mean mediation, it leads to conversations being somewhat apples and oranges in so many ways. And another thing that also happened in the ADR field is that the ADR field, as Bernie Mayer wrote in Beyond Neutrality back in 2004, he says one of the problems with the ADR field is that it has become so identified with neutrality, specifically with the mediator role, that it doesn't have any space to grow beyond that, even though it can provide other roles and other jobs and other professional approaches and other all sorts of things, but it is so identified with mediation that there's no space for that to grow. Think about that. Think about if online mediation became the focal point of what everybody thought ODR was about and kind of wouldn't let it grow either conceptually or in terms of demanding its services beyond Zoom mediation. Instead of 25 years of effort suddenly blossoming into this huge thing, it would be 25 years of effort kind of tossed into the rubbish bin of history, and we're left with Zoom mediation. And that might be a cause for concern. I have my own concern about online teaching. I've been teaching online for about 15 years now, and exclusively for 12, 13 years. And honestly, as a professional online teacher, I don't know whether my stock, quote unquote, has gone up or down during the COVID period. In other words, I don't know whether what's happened now is everybody realizes that online teaching is a thing and can be done, is an important thing, and therefore, professionals in that field who have been doing that for years are to be valued, or Au contraire, yeah, been there, done that, good enough in a pinch, but I don't like it, and I don't want to ever hear anything about it anymore. And at the institutional levels, you know, institutions might shy away from online teaching because they had all that COVID period experience with online. So I don't know exactly where that goes, but I can apply that to ODR and see why those mixed emotions would exist. And finally, there was a trend as everybody came online that suddenly a lot of experts popped up. And some of these experts were people who had been quietly doing this for years and years. And some of the experts who popped up and either offered training or advice or interviews in the media were people who had done 3 Zoom mediations and either expressed themselves as experts, or someone else had sort of deemed them as an expert. And there were many situations in which it was, you know, it was sort of easy to tell that that many people are unaware that there is a long, not only history, but a large foundation of knowledge. And it's not all being made up right here on the spot. There's a lot left, you know, there's a lot that already exists. I don't have those reservations. Well, I have some of those. But I'm really delighted. First of all, it's you know, part of my culture is, oh yay, more family. So you know, more people on board, I feel, you know, can only be good for us. I particularly, one thing that I think is that a lot of the true resistance to technology, I don't know if I can do it. I don't want to get into it because what if? That's been trampled down, or at least kicked really low. And I think that at least it will be lower even after and beyond. It'll be lower when the ODR field comes up with whatever the next suggestion for online applications or online technology for dispute resolution. I think people will be more adept, even if all they have done is Zoom. They'll be more adept at figuring systems out, and they'll be more you know, open to trying it out, or at least to recognize that, hey, yeah, I can do this. I can take a course in it and figure out how to do it. So I think that overall, the barrier for people to participate in the ODR world has been lowered forever. That's a bit of a prediction, but okay, I'll go that far. What we do is no longer absolutely unfamiliar to anybody in all of these professions. And that's a good thing. And even if they got the wrong impression or the wrong idea, even if they didn't like it, they still know about it. And they still had this period in which that was the thing that was. And the thing that most interests my theoretical and academic, but also practice side, is that there's this huge natural experiment. Nobody set this in motion. Nobody designed this. Nobody anticipated it. And in this playground of thousands of mediators practicing online day in, day out, there is so much opportunity for learning. There's so much opportunity for research, so much opportunity to take the field of online mediation, no matter what we've learned about it for the past 25 years. Already, many new ideas are being thrown out there just over the 6 months that nobody had voiced in the past 25. I'll share a few of those soon. And finally, I've been trying to get out of ODR advocacy. About 5 years ago, I took a resolution that ODR doesn't need me to advocate for it anymore. It can speak for itself. The fewer arguments we have with people about why this can work, the more time we have to talk about with them about how to make it work and how it can work best, and to bring them into those conversations. And that's the breakout that I'm really looking forward to. Everybody streamed online and started mediating online. What happened? Preconceptions as opposed to what they met. The first thing that they met is that they might be crabby about it. You're all gonna have to forgive me. But it works in a pinch, okay? And I think that if there's anything that comes out of, again, dozens to hundreds of conversations, is that sure, lots of people didn't choose to do this, and lots of people still don't prefer to do it, but does it fundamentally work? Can you do it? Yes. And so that's a hurdle. I think that there's no going back. And that's one preconception that was smashed The second thing, a second preconception, is that another thing that people would say is that, oh, I don't mind, but my parties would never agree to it, and lawyers would never agree to it. I never knew where their absolute knowledge of that came from. But that was a very powerful assumption. Like what people want is what we give them in the room. It's not only that we know you need the magical human touch and we need them in the room for that. There's this assumption that parties to mediation and their lawyers, they know exactly what they want. They know what makes for a good mediation. They know that it can only happen in a room, and they know that it will not work online, is something I've been told, one followed by however many zeros you want. Then it turns out that, again, do put those pictures together. In a pinch, at least, there was, I encountered very, very little resistance from parties, and very little resistance from lawyers. Of course, there were outliers in this, but I did not hear of a single lawyer who said to their client, no, this won't last more than 6 months. Let's wait. I haven't heard it. It doesn't mean I've heard everybody, but they came along and it worked in a pinch. And parties did too. And finally, with regard to the human touch, that seemingly ineffable and seemingly unattainable thing, well, it turns out that apparently you can get enough of it. Most professional mediators that I know did not say, I'm going to sit out the COVID period without mediating, okay? And most mediators I know went online during the COVID period. Most of them did not lower their prices owing to the online delivery format. The few mediators that answered me and told me, yes, I have lowered my prices, I think it was 3, all said, well, I lowered my prices because I'm saving costs. I rent a conference room for our sessions. I don't need to rent the conference. Then I'm going to pass that on to the client. Nobody told me that, no, I charge less now because I'm delivering a less magical product. I'm delivering a product that is inherently less capable. So I know there's a side of me now that's coming off and is a little cynical and a little kind of, oh yeah, right. But still, when you get into it and you ask the questions about the human touch, and some say, well, I was surprised, or you get by. I think that now that we're past the hurdle, now I'm going to talk for just a little bit about the human touch, just as an example of the things we can start to learn much more about now that we couldn't start to learn about a year ago. Or some people were trying to learn this a year ago, but we didn't have like this vast crew working on it a year ago. If the human touch is what people thought was missing from online mediation, and it turns out that it's not absolutely missing, then you can ask 2 questions. One is you can ask, well, then was the human touch really as important as we thought it was? That's one line of thinking. And another way of thinking is assuming that it really is key. Apparently you can do it online. You can get it online. And then the question just becomes, how can you get more of it? And how can you do it better? And that's a whole different conversation. And that's a conversation which we might now hear lots more suggestions and then experiment with them, excuse me, than we've had in the past. And I'd like to, at this moment, before we all get into that, I'm going to suggest that we not only refrain from you can't to how can we, but that we raise the bar. An anecdote, back when I started designing our program at Creighton, the online graduate program, there what it was, a campus-based program, and I was asked to help design and lead the online program. And 2 weeks into the process of designing, I suddenly realized that we had unconsciously, but clearly adopted a mindset that we wanted to do this, seriously. And we wanted our students online to have just as good an experience studying online as they would if they were here in our classroom in Omaha. And it was 2 weeks of working on this before I realized, why would we set the bar there? That is such a random bar. The bar should instead be, we want to make sure that our students have the absolutely, utmostly awesomest, wonderfulest, full educational experience that they can have in the online environment in which we're teaching them. And that might involve doing some things that would actually be better online than they would be in a classroom. So setting the classroom as what you need to emulate is it's a very human thing. Humans do this in every technological process they take online, including teaching, including mediation, including all elements of communication. But you can raise the bar higher, and I'm gonna, this will sound now somewhat radical, but the notion of maybe we can do human touch better online than we can in the room. You'll never know till you try. And if you don't set the bar high, then you're never gonna try harder than what can we do in the room. So a question of how can you leverage technology to that, I'll give a couple of examples soon, but that's less the point than the changing of the frame and the changing of the conversations. So in order to understand it, and again, this is just as an example of how we can start thinking, is to take these terms that people use as generalities, such as, no, you can't bring the human touch online, and maybe we could break down the human touch and figure out what people mean when they say the human touch. And then we could start figuring out piece by piece how to do it or how to improve it online. Hey, I'll add on that it wouldn't hurt to do that thinking and then figure out ways to do it better in the room as well. But since it's sort of an ineffable yet accepted thingy, it's not necessarily as broken down. So here, just as these are the results of conversations on the left side, mainly just words that people often say when they're trying to kind of explain the human touch. And you can think of the words that you would use. And while I know what all of those words mean, and I also know what everybody meant when they were saying it, it's hard to know exactly what to do with it. Be warm or create warmth is a very amorphous kind of terminology. Now, other people or people using many terms would also say some of the words from the right column, and there are many other terms we could throw in here. The words on the right column, they are perhaps a little more professional, some of them, but that's not the point here, because I intuitively understand both columns, and I think everybody else does. But the column on the right are things that actually have been explored. They have been explored both primarily in a in-person setting. Not all of them have been fully explored online, but at least we know where to start. And we can explore how we do those things in the online arena. So I've written some on the issue of trust, and others have written also on trust online. I'm working now on something that kind of wraps together trust, rapport, and empathy. But there are so many other ways to try and figure out how we bring these elements of the human touch online. And as I said, as we explore and understand what makes for the human touch, I expect us to get better at doing it in the room, because now we know what we're doing. I'll report, and I don't know, my colleagues who are now teaching online, I don't know if they have that same experience, because their transition online was much more abrupt and bleak than my own was. I'm now a much better classroom teacher because of the process I went through in figuring out how to teach online. So now when I return to a classroom, I look at my teaching differently, and I feel that I'm a better teacher in the classroom because I think about teaching differently. I don't want to get lost in my slides, so I will just give an example. Here's what a breakdown of some human touch elements that we're missing, or some elements that might help us with human touch. The easiest one to look at is natural eye contact, right? Which doesn't exist online. I have the email in there. If I had more time, I'd go into it, because it was figuring out what was missing from the human touch was very easy. People said, but there's no body language, there's no eye contact, I don't see the other. So the human touch there is kind of in your face or not in your face, how much we're missing it. And video brought a lot of the human touch back, and yet people were still reticent because you can't really get the human touch. Those conversations hardly changed. So here's some things that we're missing. Here are the things that we have. These are the tools that we have at our disposal through which to create or enhance or support human touch. And it's just a matter of figuring out how to do it. Now, right, sure, we can't put an arm around a distraught party if that's your style of, mediation interaction. But there are other things you can do. And these are some of your tools. How do you do it? Let's figure it out. Let's experiment. Maybe this is vain of me. I've always wanted there to be a law, an Ebner law, like Murphy's Law. I would settle for Murphy's Law, right? Everything goes wrong. But I've never been smart enough to, to capture a physical concept or and in 2020, I'm going to allow myself the vanity of noticing something that almost had mathematical precision. And that is, and I've dubbed that the first law of online mediation, perhaps in 2020 and perhaps forever. I'm not going to argue it. And you can tell me that, sure, we've had many conversations that didn't go that way. But you had many conversations that did go that way. And what I have found most helpful to remind people when they're considering how do we make decisions in mediation, mediator decisions, not content decisions. How do we approach issues in mediation? How do we, for example, how do we bring the human touch to mediation? I go to what I frame now as the second law, and this is less of a law, but those who have been doing it for a long time know this to be true. That while the tendency, while you're just getting started, is to focus on the Zoom settings and are the breakout rooms set up, and can everybody hear me, and is my internet strong enough, and all of that, and it's tense and intense of making sure all that is working. In the end, online mediation isn't, it's not, online comes first because of English sentence structure. It's really mediation. And if you've been mediating for 5 or 10 or 20 years, and you remind yourself to put a mediator frame around any question that comes up, such as, I need more human touch in here, you will figure out the answer. So I'm not even going to give more examples of how to do that. I'm going to promise you that Ebner's second law holds, and take it to the bank. And I'll be happy if anyone wants to be in touch. I'll be happy to hold long conversations over it. What have we learned in the COVID period about online mediation? The quick answer, which I will provide in 3 different learning modes, is nothing. We've learned nothing. There was hardly any research, solid research conducted on video-based mediation before COVID, and I'm not aware of any real solid research to come out on online video-based mediation during COVID. Okay, we have a lot of stories. We have a lot of short articles, short pieces in lawyer magazines and mediator magazines and blogs and websites and reports and all sorts of things of people saying things that make a lot of sense, but that doesn't mean that they're true. And what they are, and here's the final way to say it for those who need references to pop culture in order to get things, what we have received is a lot of opinions, a lot of stories, and a lot of ideas, some of them ideas that have not been explored prior to COVID. And here's where new stuff comes up, okay? And I'd like to suggest that what we've been given in this natural experiment is not a lot of new knowledge, but we have been given a vast array of new hypotheses. And those hypotheses can be explored, and they can be explored scientifically, and I hope some of them will. They can also be explored in terms of, let's call it practical experimentation, perhaps through more practitioners getting involved in trying them out, sharing anecdotes. At least we can understand exactly what it is we need to work on and experiment with in a sharper way. Perhaps we can notice trends, at least in what people think, and it'll be based on more experience and more voices. So whether you want to go full-on scientific or only sort of pseudo-scientific with this, it's a step up or 10 steps up from this is what I did, this is what I've done in 2 or 3 mediations and it's worked. And so much of what we know about mediation in the room is anecdotal that I'd like to offer us this opportunity. Let's recognize this right away and straight away call them hypotheses. And I hope that some of you, if your tendency is to conduct research, will look into these. And I'm not going to go through these. These are just interesting ideas that were never, as far as I know, were never said, never voiced. Perhaps it makes it more difficult to fall back into their old communication dynamics. I sort of heard edges of that before. One of the problems with viewing these articles and blogs and statements and opinions outside as if they were data is that many of them are conflicting. And here are examples. I have both many conversations that go both ways, and for each of these I also have at least one source, if not more, of people who have published, at least in a short opinion article. So people are saying conflicting things, and so just choose which one you want to be your default hypothesis and go explore it. But the examples on this screen are a good example of why we need to be really careful about assuming just because something kind of went the same way in 3 online mediations that we did, and we spoke to another mediator who also sort of said, hey, yeah, that sounds familiar. We need to be a little more careful than calling that full-on knowledge. But the future is really exciting in terms of learning. Let's take a look at where we are now. So our group, our community has grown. Our level of tech adeptness has grown across society and across the mediation profession. We have people's attention far more than we did in the past. Has mediation transformed because it has gone to Zoom? I would agree with everything Sir Richard wrote here about how courts have not essentially been transformed just because things are now conducted via video conference. I'm going to go ahead and suggest the same about mediation. However, doing it through mediation has brought us to the foothills, far closer, or a little higher up amongst the foothills than we were a year ago. And now we have more people to work with. We have more provisions. We have more cases to work with. And we have more really skilled and curious minds on board. And I think that now is a really exciting time to be in ODR because of this online transition of mediation, even if it is temporary. And to explain why that is, I'll now do a mapping or a remapping of the field of ODR, kind of a you are here, which might be a helpful way to, for many, it might help to summarize some of the Cyber Week themes. So there are several established areas in ODR. One is something I call replication, which is replication of ADR, of alternative dispute resolution processes online, such as online mediation, as we're speaking about in this session, such as online negotiation, such as online arbitration, such as online restorative justice. And the point of all these is, let's take the familiar process and replicate it as closely as possible using technology to connect over distance. And that area of ODR has been with ODR since the start. Some of the first experiments in ODR were exactly online mediation replication experiments, and up to this very session, which is focused on that, or was focused on that till now. Now here's a shift, but there are other areas in ODR, and we've heard about them during Cyber Week. One of them is systems. Okay, ODR systems, which says, let's not look at individual processes. Let's look at flows of many cases. Or let's look, another way of looking at it is, let's look at the flow a case goes through until it reaches a particular process. What is the lifespan of a case, or what is the lifespan of 1 million cases? And how can we design systems that support and convey disputes from being a dispute along the path to being resolved? So one good example to distinguish between a process and a system is by mentioning eBay, which at the beginning, the very first eBay cases between buyers and sellers were resolved through replication mediation processes. Ethan Katch did some of those with his group, and then SquareTrade did many of those. But eBay cannot conduct all of the disputes between buyers and sellers via replication. You thought there are too many mediators on the market? Well, there are not enough mediators to conduct. Now, back 10 years ago, eBay had 60 million cases a year. By now, it must be much more, and that's just eBay. And Amazon and Alibaba and just about every large online marketplace or merchant has some sort of an ODR system in place. Much of it is automated. So a lot of systems thinking in ODR is automation. Sometimes at the very end of it, there are humans involved. And the third area of ODR is applying artificial intelligence to disputes or to negotiations in order to achieve outcomes. It can be applied either to a mass of cases or to a single case, but the idea is how can artificial intelligence either settle disputes on their own or make recommendations, give advice, engage in education to parties based on what they need to learn and know and do given their circumstances. The area or the issue receiving a lot of attention in the past 5 years in the ODR field is ODR in the courts. This is a picture of a British courthouse. The US, for example, is not as advanced as the UK or as China in terms of taking this all the way to full-on online delivery of justice services from case submission to judgment. China has set up fully online courts in which there simply is no way to participate face-to-face. The UK, this picture is not only a picture of a courthouse, it's a picture of a courthouse with a for sale sign on it. In a fascinating game of justice chicken, the UK has gone and sold off 50% of its courthouses and just said, we are going online. So that's a commitment and a kind of a thinking mode. The US certainly is not in that place. The reason I'm not listing it as a full-on area in ODR in its own self is because it incorporates building blocks. Court ODR incorporates building blocks from the other three. Okay, many of them incorporate, let's say, a case management and case flow system. So that's a system. Okay, and one part of that system might be a replication process, such as online mediation or online automated negotiation. Some courthouses, some court ODR projects involve artificial intelligence to different degrees. Some do not, and some are what we might call, let's call it dumb software. Okay, or just communication platform for such as by conducting Zoom over for mediation. Really, that's not a function of artificial intelligence. So court ODR incorporates elements of the other three. And I'd like in my last couple of thoughts to share another area of ODR that I think that this influx of people into our community, we will all have our eyes open to some extent by technology. And what might that do? And what I'd like to suggest, and this will happen in the days beyond, I wrote a paper a couple of years with Alison Carroll from Northwestern University. We reviewed the literature on ODR and the practice on ODR, and we discovered what we thought was a really interesting thing, and that is that the ODR field dealt with those three areas, and the area that it hardly dealt with at all was the notion of technology that can be used in the mediation room. Okay, so the focus on mediation proper in ODR was online mediation. And it seemed odd to us that it's 2020, or back then it was 2018, and yet the most modern piece of equipment in a mediation room is often a whiteboard. We saw that in the ODR literature. When we looked at the ADR literature, we found that the only time ADR literature spoke about technology in mediation was when it was referring to the ODR types of online replication mediation. As if you look at the ADR, whether it's standalone or embedded in law review articles on the legal side of things, it's all talking about online mediation or online arbitration or online negotiation. And there is nary a word of how can technology help us in the room. Now, that's not to say that some of what the ODR field had created cannot be used in the room. For example, Smart Settle, which Graham Ross and Carissa Boynton have demonstrated in Cyber Week, can be used by a mediator in the room to help people input their values and achieve optimized. And in fact, particularly since it's such a fiendishly complex piece of software to operate, very often it's something that can only be used by a trained facilitator who actually knows how to do that. So it is to some extent used in rooms. But largely, the ODR field did not look, how can we improve the ADR room? And the ADR field largely assumed that the ODR people would take care of everything technological. And we were left with that gap of technology in the room. Now, if you look at people trying to have a good conversation in which they need to make life or death decisions, and you want to know which part of the Death Star you're going to blow up and where you go in, they found it perfectly natural to utilize technology for different purposes. I'm not saying that that's the only, I'll be honest, that's how I want my mediation table to look like. But setting that aside, might there be other ways in which technology in the room can help face-to-face mediators to serve our clients better, to achieve traditional mediation goals of autonomy and self-determination and voluntary and win-win outcomes and all of the good stuff? Perhaps technology can help us with that. As a field, mediation has not been exploring that. And I think this is really a fascinating opportunity for folks who have taken a step out of the room, become more familiar with technology. When you come back to the room, you might ask yourself, how can technology help me in the room if I limit that by saying, and I'm not allowed to say, because now I can hold Zoom sessions in between face-to-face meetings. No, set that aside. We know that. We've learned that. We've all recognized that. We're good. But how else? How else? And I think that's a fascinating question that is about to get answered, I hope, in 100 ways. If you Google Noam Ebner, SSRN, you'll find my papers. That paper is called Mind the Gap. We've offered some ideas, but mainly we've stirred the pot. And I think that now, in COVID and post, is a great time to look at that. And finally, going back to traditional mediation, I'd like to suggest, just as I said before, just as I became a better in the room teacher by recreating my teaching for the online. So if we learn to do this well, despite all of the hardships in doing so, then on our way back into the mediation room, we might cope with new challenges. Not technology, but not in the room challenges that we faced before. For example, this: how do we read parties when we only have half a face to work with instead of one? So we're going to have to start looking at parties in ways we've never looked at them before. All of a sudden, if we talked about facial expressions, now we're going to be forehead experts. But I have no doubt that we will, and that people will figure that out. In other words, we're going to learn things now about in the room mediation that we didn't know before. And when we do, I hope that we'll be able to up our game on in the room mediation. And I have here human touch once again at the end as an example, but the same can be said about every other element that is crucial to mediation. Online, in the room, same old, same old. And I'll leave you with this thought that I think that beginning today, the day that everybody came online, I think things are going to really be accelerating in terms of how interesting. Things have been fascinating in ODR for the past 25 years. I've been for the past 15. It's been fascinating. I think that the pace at which things will get really fascinating is going to pick up, because all of these things that we've been speaking about for years, or some of them, not the mind-boggling AI stuff, but a lot of the basic technology has now become technologically boring. And this is when we figure out how to put it all, both communication tools and other technologies, to interesting social and interpersonal use. This is going to be fascinating. I've written papers on some of these topics, and you can find them on SSRN. Feel free to write me. If you want to read a little bit more about ODR, there are about 900 books, articles, and books chapters available in the ODR bibliography. Folks, I've noticed that we are now closing in on an hour and a half. So I'm going to, somewhat artificially, but still, I'm going to thank you for your stamina, first of all. I'm going to thank you for being with us. for sharing time with me. I look forward to hearing from some of you. Those who want to hear more, you know where to find me. Meanwhile, thanks for attending Cyber Week 2020. And if we do not see each other till then, I look forward to seeing you all at Cyber Week 2021. Take care, everybody.